Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this video where I build the RGM-79HC GM Guard Custom. I've built quite a few of these GM kits, both in high grade and in master grade, and I really like them all. The GM mobile suit design is my favorite of anything in the Gundam universe. This one has been really special. When I got it, I thought, okay, it's a cool looking GM with this big ridiculous shield and one tiny gun, and some beam daggers. And I got it mainly because it was a GM, but the build of this kit has been so very nice for a high grade kit. Except for one across the top of the head, there's no seams on this guy. It's really, really nicely done on Bandai's part. So if you're looking for a very nice kit that you don't have to do a lot of seam work on, this is definitely one. Now, up to this point, because I'm kind of filming this all out of order, but I built the kit. I snapped it up a long time ago without painting. I mean, like 6 or 8 months ago, and it's been sitting on my shelf, and I decided to finish it up. I've painted the kit using Mr. Color Gundam color paints for the most part. I use MS White for the white parts. I believe I used MS Blue for the blue parts, but of course you can pick any color. I use AK Real Color Black for the black parts, including the internal frame, and then some other colors as I'll show along the way for the yellow and some of the other details. This video, this video's kind of come together at the last moment, and when you watch it, you'll probably go, "Yeah, I can tell." But the video picks up where I start painting the detail parts. The base paint is already on, and I start painting the detail parts. And I'm going to do this one a little bit different. I filmed it as I worked, and I'm going to narrate over it. So I'm just going to see how this format works, and let me know what you think of it. And so with all that said, I'm going to continue on with the build of this GM Guard Custom. I started the detail painting with some Gundam Color Mobile Suit Blue, and I used a little bit of Mr. Color leveling thinner just to thin it out. Now this is a lacquer paint, so it takes a little bit of a different application technique. You do more of a dabbing than necessarily painting it on. It's something you have to get used to, but it works really well. Generally it settles out nicely. I did leave a few bubbles in here, and I had to go back later and sand those out and fix it. But after that, I went on to using Model Color Black and some Airbrush Flow Improver to thin that out. And I just painted details mostly on the leg and the chest, a few other areas around the mobile suit. And I used my Army Painter Regiment brush here. It's a great brush for detail painting like this. Then I went on to the Sky Gray. I like using Sky Gray on white armor to just paint a few varying color sections so that it doesn't look just so darn boring. And just to give it a little bit of some visual interest, I blocked this out and filled that in, and then gave it about 10 minutes to dry, and then went back with a second layer so I got it up to full opacity. I also painted the chest vents with gray so that I could then go on and paint them this gold yellow from Game Color, a very punchy yellow color. And it took about 3 coats. You see here the first coat going on, and this shows me applying the 3rd coat. So 3 coats to get full opacity. I wasn't too worried about being extremely neat with it. I knew I could go back later and clean it up around the edges, and I did that with I went back to my black color, and I just cleaned up around the edges of the chest vents. And even here I wasn't too worried about being too neat, because I knew I'd put in some wash, and that wash would help fill out those areas also. I cleaned up the knee vent also. Again, it wasn't too neat because I knew that a later wash would straighten this edge out and blend everything in together. I add a little bit of lead belcher to the head, to the faceplate. Later on, I'd add a wash just to give that a distinct look. It's going to fit behind a green faceplate, so that should look pretty cool. I also like using this lead belcher for painting thrusters and vents and verniers and things like that. It's a paint from Citadel, the Warhammer 40K folks, and it's a great gunmetal kind of steely color, very all-purpose dark silver color. And with all that painted, the model is ready for a gloss coat. I use Future floor polish for that. For the decals, this shows the tools that I like to use in my decal prep work. And I just take my hobby knife, cut out whatever decal I'm going to use. Bandai decals are very good, so they don't have a lot of carrier film around the edge, so I didn't have to cut too close. And then I dip it in some hot water that I keep off camera. It's on a coffee warmer, so that it's hot, it's coffee hot, but it's not boiling hot. And I live dangerously and put that in position with my hobby knife. If you're not comfortable doing that, use a paintbrush or some other instrument like that. But as I always have to do, we have cats, and I had to remove a cat hair. I don't think I built a model in 10 years that doesn't have a cat hair. But I just kept positioning this until I got it where I wanted. And then once I was happy with it, I grabbed a cotton bud and just squeegeed out the excess water and any air bubbles that are behind that decal. This is a very important step to make sure you don't get silvering on your decals. With the decal in place, I give an application of Solvaset. This is a decal setting. It's a softener. You put this on the decal, it makes it, it kind of melts it a little bit. It stays in place, but once you put this on, don't touch it again. Let that dry, or you'll end up messing up the decal. And there you see, I'll go back later. I always put a second coat on about an hour later, and if I need to slice any bubbles, I clean those up. And here's how it looks when everything's done. And you can see the decals there on the chest. I put some on the big goofy shield, and just as identifying markings. There's one on the shoulder, Anaheim Electronics. Next, I wanted to do some dry brushing just to highlight the edges of the various pieces of armor. So I used gray, white, and blue. And when I'm dry brushing, I always put the paint in the palette without any thinning. I just do it neat. Otherwise, you're going to get some really bad streaks if you start thinning the paint out. Vallejo is great for this because it's a Vallejo model color because it's a thicker paint. I like using a flat brush because I was going to be doing a more concentrated dry brushing. I used a smaller flat brush, and then I just wipe it off onto a piece of paper towel, making sure to keep it on camera while I do it. And the thing with dry brushing is you want to wipe off more paint than less paint. It's not a problem if you get too little paint or too much paint off, because you can always go back and add more. Too much paint can be a problem. Once I have it wiped off, I just grab the part where I wanted to put it, and I began doing a very focused dry brushing. I wasn't being haphazard about it, because this really is representing more of an edge highlight than it is trying to weather it or anything like that. Oftentimes, and keeping it on camera is also important, oftentimes when you're working with colors like this, pure black, pure white, or things that are close to it, adding in some edge highlighting helps the person who's looking at the model. It helps them understand where the angles are, the contours, what stands out from other things. So it's not entirely realistic, although we are dealing with a Gunpla here, but which is science fiction, but it helps them see what the parts of the model are. So I think it's a very important step in terms of, if you're going to put all this work into painting and weathering it, it's important that people actually see what's going on there. So I went around the edges on this black part. I thought it would be a great way to show how I did that. Now right there where those vents are, I got in a little heavier, which lightened that area. I can go back later with black, a glaze of black, and clean that up just a little bit so that it's not quite so stark around the flat area on either side of those vents. But you see how it just really helps that detail pop out and makes it the edges and the shapes very apparent. The head turned out very nice. You'll see the light blue on the blue portions there, the gray on the black. I thought that turned out really well. The shield, the blue wasn't quite as dramatic as I wanted, but I knew later chipping would help bring those edges out. The white, I gave up even using it because there wasn't enough difference there to make it look good. The chest turned out pretty good too. I was really happy with that. I got a little heavier here, but I figured that would establish some chipping look, start the weathering process, so that was fine. I did that. You can see it on the arms here also. It's just looking a little streaky, and that could suggest weathering, so that worked out very well there. On the foot, you can see the blue, and it's fairly subtle. It introduces a little bit of a chipped look, but it helps define those shapes. And also on that knee vent. Then the gun, I dry brushed heavily with lead belcher just to give it a steely look, because I think it looks pretty doggone cool. Now I wanted to do some panel lining, and there's a lot of ways you can do this, but one of the simplest and Bandai plastic safe ways is to use a mechanical pencil. I get a sanding stick and I just sharpen the lead down. It doesn't matter what size you use, because with the sanding stick you get it to a fine point. And then I just go in and draw in those panel lines. This is a really simple and fast way to do it. Even if you're going to later put on other washes to bring out the panel lines, this helps. If you want them to be very stark, this helps make sure that the panel lines really stand out and there's really a lot of contrast. And later washes, even if they get a little grainy, will look very good. So I just drew that in there, and then it can leave some graphite dust behind, so I just went in and cleaned that up with this big brush. That can actually streak it and give a nice pleasing weathering effect sometimes. Then I went around the rest of the model and drew this in. Some areas, if a little bit of paint collects in the panel line, the pencil will actually clean that out. That's okay, it doesn't hurt anything. You see that it leaves a little bit of graphite behind, which is okay also, and I just drew those in for a very stark look. Later weathering would help tone that down some, so it's not going to always look that stark. Notice I cleaned off the edge when I sanded that down just a little bit there to make sure there wasn't too much graphite hanging around on that guy. Even where two parts join together, like on this lower armor here, and when I get to the upper armor up there, you can draw in between those, even though there's a little bit of a gap there. I drew here just to deepen that shadow so that when I put a wash in later, it would look pretty good. Gave it a little bit of a cleanup. You can use an eraser and even odorless thinner to clean up the pencil lines. So if you need to do some cleanup, either one of those are a good option depending on where you're trying to do the cleanup. You can see how the leg turned out looking. Nice panel lining I like there, and that'll do. Later applications of other shades and washes will help clean up some of the edges, like around that knee vent, but this is exactly the effect that I was going for. The next thing I want to do is add some additional shading using Citadel's Non-Oil Gloss. I like using a little liner brush for this. It's just a cheap synthetic liner brush. This is a gloss acrylic shade. I like using gloss on gloss because it pulls into the recesses better. It doesn't leave tide marks as bad. It doesn't pool as bad. It just gives a really clean application compared to using standard known oil, which is matte. So when you're putting this on a gloss surface, you get a little better performance. It's still not quite as good as oils and enamels, but it works very well. And again, the key here is it's Bandai plastic safe. So you can see that I'm enhancing around those whatever those circle things are. And here's where you notice the pencil line up there. Later on, I'm going to add some more of this known oil in. I'm cleaning up the vents a little bit. That cleans up the edge there. Later on, when I put some around the outside, it cleans up that pencil line there and makes that look fairly neat and tidy there. I also use this in the chest. I want those chest sections to look very distinct. I want there to be a very obvious separation. So I go in fairly heavily between the vents to make sure that happens and really stand out. But I also run it along the edges, which again cleans up that separation between the yellow and the black. Now I've got a fairly nice, neat edge, and it covers up any of my painting mistakes. Now, one of the things that is important is when you're using this known oil gloss, you can clean it up. If you get a little bit of airbrush thinner, and it's key that the model surface be glossed. Get some airbrush thinner and just a cheap paint brush like this, and I get just a little bit of that Vallejo airbrush thinner, dab off most of it, wipe some off on my thumb so the brush is just barely damp. And if you do this within a couple of minutes of the wash drying, you can actually clean this up, and it's not going to leave any kind of tide marks behind. But if you let it dry more than about just a few minutes, you're not going to be able to do that cleanup. All right, for the gun, I wanted it to have a really heavily weathered look. So after the dry brush, the lead belcher was dry, I went back with an application of more known oil. This gives a really nice steely look to any of the weapons that you're building for your Gunpla. So give it a real heavy coat and it'll look really cool. And here you can see the final pieces. I was really happy with how the leg turned out. Of course, there's still a lot of work to go, but it turned out fairly well. The arm, it's a little plain, but later weathering will kind of dress it up a little bit. But it looks nice. The chest, man, I like the colors on that chest. The decals, the colors. Notice I painted the little vents on the side, the little thruster vents. I painted those in with black for later additional work. And the head, I liked the way the head turned out. It looks really cool in my opinion. Okay, next up will be the chipping. And on the white, I'm going to use this mechanical pencil that I used earlier. This is a great little tool for very precise chipping. You can just come in and really just kind of draw in the chips wherever you want. Keep them very small, and whether you call it scale appropriate or just light chipping, doesn't really matter. You do it how you want. And what it'll give you is, and once you put a matte coat on, it's going to be kind of a gray look to it, dark gray, almost black. So if you're wanting the chipping to look more as if it's a composite material underneath, then this will work really nice for you. Another thing that chipping can do, one thing to always think about, is that chipping in a way helps define edges. So if you're wanting the various corners and edges of the model to appear a little more visible to the viewer, chipping can be a great way to do that. Just like highlighting here on this black.
this gray dry brush highlights the edge and makes that more apparent. It works the same way with chipping. It helps the eye identify where the edges are on the white armor, and just helps the shape of the mobile suit become apparent at what you'd call a normal viewing distance. For the chipping on the blue, I'm going to use Vallejo's Sky Gray. I could use white, but in my opinion, when you chip against a darker color with white, it looks way too stark. I think that if I chip with the Sky Gray, and I've done this before, when viewed, your eye tends to read it as white, maybe a dingy white. If you do it as pure white, or even just the base white color, this kind of off-white that I used here, I just find, like I said, I just think it looks too stark. So I like to do that with Sky Gray. Now for this, because I want it to be a little heavier around the edge of the feet here, and up in these areas, I'm going to use a sponge that I hold in these clamps. And all I'll do is get some of the paint. This is unthinned paint. I don't thin the paint when I'm spongering. And I dab it off on the paper towel. And what I'm looking for is just the pattern that I want applied to the model. You get off as much or as little as you want. And then I just go in and, looking around the camera, I start dabbing that on. And again, you can do this as heavy or as light as you want. You could do multiple applications so that you get the effect that you're looking for. Sorry if that was out of focus. And here, I'll show. See that right there? It's just a lightly chipped area. And when I look at it, that reads, my eye reads that as white, not Sky Gray. So I'm just going to continue on around the model in these blue areas and just do that chipping there, just to give it a light dose of it, because again, I don't want this to look like it's too beat up, but especially around the feet here. And I'm working under the premise that the blue would be painted over the white and therefore might chip a little heavier, so it works in my mind. So I'm going to do that, and I'll show you what it looks like when I finish that. Another thing I like to do when I'm finishing a model is add some grease and grime stains, just, you know, to look like fluid leaks, that kind of thing. I use oils, I use enamels. Those are great to use. On Gunpla, the thinner can be a little harsh. So when I can, I like to opt for acrylic type products. Two of my favorite are from Vallejo's Weathering Effects line. This 73813 oil stains is a great, it's kind of brownish, reddish. It is gloss, but it really does a good job of making oil type stains. And then they've also got this 73817 petrol spills. It's very dark, almost black, maybe just a touch of blue to it. Both of these actually are very similar to Known Oil and Agrax Earthshade from Citadel, the gloss versions of them. So if you don't have these but you have those, they work about the same. I've got some of the petrol stains loaded up in my palette here, and then I've got this liner brush that I'll use for application. And basically what I do is I just go around and put it where I think stains might occur, leaks might occur. Like one of my favorite areas is just underneath these little round doodads here. It's at the same time kind of a shade, but I let it go a little beyond where you'd normally do with the shade, just to represent some staining. And you see how I'm applying that, just kind of dabbing that on. You can go back and use the method that I showed of cleaning up with the brush, the airbrush thinner. I just gotta put that on there to represent some staining and some grease and grime where, you know, hydraulic fluid might come out. And you can go back over this with the other color, multiple colors. And in fact, multiple colors give it a nice depth. So don't be afraid to combine them. And because these acrylics dry very quickly, you can go in and use them, use one and then put another over it just a few minutes later. It's not like with oils where you're having to wait a long time for things to dry up. But I just go around the mobile suit, and wherever I think I'd like to see kind of an extra collection of grime or stains or anything like that, I just add that in. You know, areas like this vent here, I want to give that a little more than I already had. Underneath it can be a good area. So wherever your imagination determines that, hey, I think it would get kind of dirty right there, go ahead and dirty it up. Just have fun with it. I do. This is my favorite part of building any model, is just adding these stains and things like that. It's even better when you keep it on camera, ain't it? All right, I'm going to continue doing this, and I'll show you some other things that I do with the weathering. Okay, I've used both of those colors and some staining, and you can see, especially there at the top of the leg. I always like going kind of heavy at the top of the leg on a Gunpla because there's a lot of hydraulics there and a lot of pressure, and there have to be stuff getting out. But I've used just the two colors together. I think it just gives it a more interesting look. You can go back and you can tone this down with some airbrushed effects, some dry brushing, some paint over it if you're not happy with it. But just I think it just gives it a little more of a look of depth, you know, and makes you wonder, well, what's going on there? Like I've got some kind of greasy stain there around the collar. Around the waist, I've got both colors going because, you know, again, there's probably going to be something leaking there. On the arm, I added some around that gray part. We don't know what that part is, but apparently it's got a leak in it. Some coming out there at the elbow. Just using my imagination as to where things might get greasy and grimy. So don't be afraid to use those and more. Now, one of the benefits of using these acrylic products like that is this is getting pretty close to the end of the build, and if you still want to use oils, you can apply oils over those, and that way you're leaving the oils till virtually the last step, or almost the last step. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to wait for the oils to dry to apply anything over it. You can put acrylic products down as the basis and then refine it with oils, and it lets you work in a little more quick fashion in terms of drying times. So the next thing I want to do is go back and I want to do some airbrush work, and I'll talk about that for a second. Now, for just some logistical reasons with the layout of my workspace and where my equipment is, I'm not going to be able to bring the airbrush to the work. I'm going to have to take the work to the airbrush, and the camera won't really work in there because of lighting and other issues. It doesn't really matter. What I plan to do, though, is just to add some airbrush effects to some of the areas. Like right here, there's this kind of exhaust, jet exhaust opening here. I want to add a little bit of an exhaust stain there with a darker color. I may do some post shading on some of the more major panel lines. I'll probably add some up here where these grease and grime effects are. And then I'll go back in and do what I call post fading, which is just giving some additional grime, you know, light dust effects, some tonal variation to the white armor and to the blue, just to break up the monotone color. But I'll do that on both of the legs, the arms, especially up here where this vent is, because I feel like there might be something more happening there in terms of stains and so forth. I'll put some around here because I think around there I could imagine that being a place where more grime and so forth happens, so I'll add some in there. There's a couple of little jet exhausts there, so I'll put some as if it's getting some exhaust stains down vertically from there. And of course on this, I'll be giving some exhaust effects on the jet nozzles there. So the airbrush, if you have one, it's a great way to add some very light effects and build it up in layers. If you don't have one, you can simulate it with, in some cases, you can use some dry brushing creatively to get the same kind of effect. You can use weathering powders. You can use oils and enamels. Just be careful when you're using oils and enamels that you don't let the thinner get into the joints or into any of the working, the articulated parts of your Gunpla, or it might break the plastic. So I'll go do the airbrush work and I'll show you what that looks like when I'm done. I finished the airbrush work on it, and I just added a few stains, like you can see very prominently right there where those vents are, and I just enhanced some of the panel lines with a little bit of post shading. I did a little more airbrush work around the waist just to beef up that stain. Put some, I read these as vents, so I put some back there. The vents on the back leg got some, did some staining effects here. You'll also note that before I move on, what I airbrushed it with was a combination of 2 parts Tamiya NATO black and 1 part whole red, and I heavily thinned it with alcohol, like 20 parts alcohol, 1 part of the paint mix. Because it does a really good job of producing kind of a smoky effect. I also put some Tamiya deck tan, just a little bit along the bottom of the feet to begin suggesting some dirt effects. Not a lot. I'm going to go and add some more in just a second here. But that was the airbrush work. Now I've put it together. Earlier stages, it was easier to go ahead and assemble all of this or work on all of this in the various parts. But towards the end of any build, I like to put it together so that I can see it as a whole. Generally, it's not too hard to keep everything balanced while you're working on it in separate parts, but at some point, it does help to see it, okay, how does it look together? Does it look right? Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be symmetrical, or, you know, if you've got staining here, you've got to have staining here. But you do what you want. I want it to look at least plausible, so that, you know, if I've over-weathered one leg compared to the rest, I either want to have a good reason for that in terms of the storyline in my head, or I want to go back and, you know, change the rest of the suit to look like it. So I've put that together so that I can just kind of evaluate it as a whole. Now, when you're doing this evaluation, if you see things that need adjustment, you go back and just do little spot applications of all of the previous processes. So if you think it needs a little chipping in one area and a little staining in the other, you just use all those different products and techniques that you've already applied and just do them where needed so that it looks like you want. But I'm pretty happy with this guy. I'll probably go through it, make a few little adjustments, but I'm fairly happy with where he's at. Fairly happy even. So the last step I wanted to do before putting a matte coat on him was just beef up the dirt effects around his feet here. Now, to do that, I like using Vallejo Model Wash. I use pigments, I've used oils, I've used enamels, I've used real dirt, I've used all sorts of things. But in this scale, I like using this because it leaves behind a very transparent layer of color that sells itself pretty well as dirt, but is Bandai safe, dries quick. It's a great tool to have in your toolkit, I guess you'd say. There's plenty of other products that you can do this with. I'm simply choosing this one for this time because I think it just works really well. So let me get this shaken and stirred and get it into my palette, and I'll show you the very simple application of it. All right, I've got some of the wash in my palette here, and I've got this just very simple old synthetic brush, nothing special, to apply it with. This can be thinned with water or airbrush thinner or flow improver or all sorts of other things. You can use it as a wash. That's initially what it's designed for. But I use it right out of the bottle. I get some on my brush and I just dab off some of the excess. And I start applying that along the feet. Now, it will go on much more opaque than it will actually dry. So if you use this, the first time you put it on, don't think, oh man, I've got to wipe all this off because I've got way more on there than I want. Give it a little while to dry so that you can see, okay, how does it look when it's wet, and then how's it going to look when it actually does dry. Let me see if I can get this on camera here. Make sure I'm being all professional. But I just dab it on, and the amount and the pattern and all of those things you decide. I move it around, I spread it out. The key is to build it up. I put on light amounts, spread it around, and then once it dries, I just decide, do I need another application or am I good with that? It's very, very controllable. Now again, I could do this with pigments. Pigments, I feel like, while they work really well and they look good, they tend to be, I think you have a little less control over them, because if you've ever started smearing pigments around, you know that they can kind of go everywhere. And on a larger scale, say you're doing a tank or a machine creator kit, that may be what you're looking for. But this is 1/144th scale. I mean, the height of a human is not even the length of that brush tip there. So if you're wanting to be in scale, and again, that's completely up to you. If you want to do it so that it looks like it's actually a 6 foot tall armored suit, that's fine. But this, I think, helps you keep it much more in scale if that's your goal. One thing to think about when you're weathering, a lot of folks will tell you that's not in scale, or that type of alloy used on that Gundam wouldn't have rusted or whatever. And I get all that. I mean, I get the universe, I get canon. I understand all that. Main point is, have fun. If you like what you're doing, just have fun with it. Don't worry about canon if you don't want to. Don't worry about scale and realism and all of those things. Just have fun with it. Well, anyway, you can see that I'm just going through and I'm just applying this stuff, and I only want it right there around the blue. I mean, this is, in real life, this would be 3 or 4 feet up on this, and I don't want it to look like it's been hanging around in the mud and walking in the woods, but I do want it to look like, okay, it's been on Earth, it's been, walking around, and it's going to stir up some dust and maybe debris from buildings that it stomps on and things like that. So I just want to suggest some dirt around there. But I'll let that dry and show you what that looks like and talk about final steps. All right, I've got the matte coat on, and I'm going to call this GM Guard Custom finished. I put in his face plate there, very last step. I left that off when I did the matte coat because I wanted it to remain a little bit shiny. So that was the very last piece to stick onto him. But I'm pretty happy with how he turned out. The mobile suit doesn't look too dirty, but it's not entirely clean, so it suggests a little bit of use. And it's a pretty cool look, I think. I've also got the gun. I left this, I didn't matte coat this. I like to leave the weapons sometimes with a little more shine to them, so they have a bit of a metallic sheen. So I left that there, and I went ahead and permanently attached the trigger finger to that so that it's easy to swap out at any point. And then I matte coated the shield. I'm not a real fan of this shield. I just think it looks a little bit weird, but it's done. It's matte coated. I chipped it up a little bit, so I may take a picture or two with it. Now, I know on video it's hard to get good views of how this guy looks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take additional photos, and those will go up on the blog, johnbias.com. There'll be a link to that blog entry in the description below this video. So if anytime you're wanting to see those additional photos, and I'll have some additional text there. I'll write about this a little bit too, so you can check out that blog entry as a supplement to this. But I can highly recommend this HG kit, this GM Guard custom kit, to any level of builder, any genre. If you're just getting into Gunpla, this is a great place to start. If you've been doing it, but you want a really no drama, cool looking little kit with some nice surface detail, this fits the bill. It's just a really wonderful example of the kind of work that Bandai does in their Gunpla model kits, because it's just such a pleasure to build, and I've really enjoyed it. And I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and I hope maybe you've learned a thing or two from it. All right, with all that being said, I'll go ahead and wrap this up. Again, look for photos on the blog with a link below to that, so you can get additional looks at this one. And thank you so much for watching. I am most grateful, especially if you've watched this far. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. There's links below to all the usual social media where you can keep up with the work that I do and interact with me. And I do really appreciate it when people contact me and just share their techniques and things that they've got going on. I like seeing that. And if you have questions, if I can be of help, I certainly don't know all the answers, but if I can help you figure out something, please don't hesitate to contact me. If you've not subscribed to this channel, click the subscribe button. I think it's down there. I would be most grateful for a subscribe. And if you like the videos, give them a like. And I'd really appreciate a share. I'm trying to grow the channel, so that would help me a lot. And there's also links to Patreon. If you like the work I do, if you'd like to support the work that I do, there's a link there, and there's some various options. And you can see the rewards that are available to Patreon subscribers. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, thank you so much for the support you do. I literally couldn't do this at the pace that I do it without your support. We just wouldn't be able to sustain that. So thank you to my current Patreon subscribers. So with all that out of the way, again, thank you for watching, and happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.